My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piraj, Sivasankar, and Guru Piranyo, fellow Jnanis. Today I'm going to continue to speak about birth, rebirth, reincarnation, and review the previous class, and then proceed further with more examples to illustrate this concept of birth, rebirth, and so on. So in the last, satsang, we spoke about, we did a thought experiment of water as a soul, or, the subtle body. Glass is the gross body, and we showed how, the water, the subtle body, is flexible enough to take whatever shape and form of the gross body. And we had a series of 5 questions, and ultimately we came to this conclusion that what do we mean by reincarnation? The body itself is recycled, so the form changes, but the basic building block remains the same. But we are not the body. We're something else. We are the conscious being. So the conscious being, the consciousness, the soul that gives us that consciousness, is formless and dimensionless and colorless. And if that's the case, then if we say it is timeless and eternal, that means there's no birth and death. So here we show that based on our assumptions or axiom, we see that which we say who we are is transcendental to space and time. Hence, this whole notion of birth and death doesn't really make sense, right? So this infinite potential and possibilities, because it's not confined by dimensions. And we see that and we left with, so what is, in this example, who are we? If we are the water molecules, then the water molecules in the first stage, or when we empty the glass, throw the water back to the ocean, the probability of getting all the molecules are exactly the same as the previous is pretty close to 0. It's non-zero, but pretty close to 0. So which means that if we assume that, then that means that the glass occupies water molecules, which may not be exactly the same water molecules as the last one. But then if you go much more subtle, you see that, the water molecules are all connected by energy and space. So what does it really matter what the molecules are? They are all still connected. So the connectedness is that the water in the previous cup, in the same cup, but the previous time before you throw it into the ocean, and the water that comes into the other, exactly the same. So again, we see that, but the essence is that, reincarnation means being born again. But we know that the matter body, goes through change. Is that what we mean by reincarnation? But we are not the body. So consciousness neither is born nor, dies. But it can occupy the glass. Are we saying the experience of that consciousness in the body is what we mean by reincarnation? Right? So again, this is something that will come back again and look at. The new examples that I'm going to show will give you greater illustration of this point. So let's, keep that in mind. What are we talking about? Is it the gross body or the subtle body? Right? Who are we? So I want to take you to model 2 of this reincarnation, another thought experiment, right? So we started off with this expansive ocean as model 1, the example that we give. Call it Paramatma as an illustration. And then we say, okay, we now capture that data, that water in a container, right? So let me call it a beaker, a container here. So the container is the gross body. Within the container, there is water. We assume that the water is subtle body as an example, right? But what is really interesting, as we saw in the earlier case, is that they look very similar. The texture is very similar, but the form is very different. One is an expansive ocean. The other one is in a contained, container. What's really interesting is that the water molecule's essence is the same. So what's in the ocean is exactly the same, at least the building blocks of what's in the beaker is exactly the same. So the form may be different, but the substance remains the same. So this is what we establish in model 1. So I'm going to take the model to a little bit more in depth. And suppose now I'm going to use the sun's reflection model, this model 2. I'm going to extend it further to the sun's reflection model. So assume we have a sun, okay? And that sun, and with the sun, we have this water, container that we had. So we have the container, which is the gross body, and then the water is the subtle body, right? And where does the water get its DNA from? It gets from the ocean. So we have, contained this in a container, such as our body, right? So the sun is reflecting into the water. So what do we see? And we see a reflection of the sun in the water. And the question we want to ask is that, is the reflection the real sun? Right? So we have the sun outside, and we see a reflection of the sun. Is the sun the real sun? So I think all of you all know what the answer to that is, right? But more important, what you see in the surface of the water, if you go deeper, the sun's radiation or the sun looks very different in different depth of that water. So what we see at the surface may be very different from what we see at the depth of our own consciousness. So here we see that, but nevertheless, we see that the reflection is a whole reflection. We see the whole sun. Now, this is really fascinating. This is the thought experiment that I used to do. I say, okay, great. But the reflection is not the real sun. Why all this is really important? I'm going to push the analysis a little bit more further. The question then is that everything that is reflecting on us, we know that the reflection, the projection of the sun that we see is not real. It's a reflection, right? So the same way we see that, how do we see the world? If you see the flowers, we are conscious of the flowers, is because the sun's radiation is hitting the flower. The spectrum is then hitting our retina, and we get an image of the flower. So we have an external flower where the radiation of the flower is now projecting in us, and we are seeing a projection. So is the flower outside is real, or what we are seeing is real? Is it? So the same thing with everything in our lives, the happiness, the sadness, everything. Isn't it a projection of the things around us? That's how the sun's projection is. And it's reflecting on that subtle body. So when we have good things around us, we see that we project happiness. And the same thing, if we have challenging things, we project. But in deep sleep, what happens? Whatever happens around us, the projections, we don't experience the projections. And we'll come back to that analysis, right? So what we are seeing here is that our life in all its dynamism, isn't it a projection, right? It's projecting on our subtle body. You can call the subtle body as mind and consciousness and so on. But nevertheless, we see that the projections are very, are based on what we see around us projects in us. And this is something very important, that Whenever we see things, good things, it projects in us, we have a happy feeling. And something which is difficult, sometimes this anger, that is, hatred, that is sadness. So here's an example that shows that is this world a projection, right? And let's go a little bit more deeper in our analysis, right? Now, suppose we are seeing the sun. If there is a ripple in the water, right? What happens to our projection, right? So we have the sun and there's a ripple in the water. Clearly, we are going to see the ripple effect. What we are going to see, the projections, the reflection is also going to have a ripple. Why this is really important is that the sun could be in its true form, but when our mind has all those fragmentation, blemishes, and is turbulent, we see the world in a turbulent way. When the water is calm and cool, we see that the projections is very different. So what we see here is the projections take the form of what the state of that subtle body is. See? So again, we see that the world that we see is nothing but the projections of the state of our mind. Is it real? Is the sun, the actual sun, and what we, the reflection in the water the same? Not really. One is real, the other one is merely a projection. Right? So again, an example to show that how the subtle body plays a key role in giving a characterization of what life is. Right? Now, I'll push the analysis a little bit more further. I have three, bodies or three containers, right? They're the same size. There's only one sun. But what we see here is that in each of the container, you'd be able to see a projection. Okay? And if the water is of the same quality, you see the same projections. If the water is not so clear, you see that the projections will be very different. So again, we see that the world that we see is dependent on that subtle body that is in there. That's what's projecting. Right? Now I go a little bit more further. Suppose the size of the container is very different, right? You have a little bit more water. And within that water, you can see the whole sun in a smaller way because, the projections is dependent on the surface, right? Surface, how big is the surface. So we see that the water in the smaller container will project a smaller image. And the same thing as you go bigger, the bigger the container, the more surface space, it gives you a bigger appearance. But the water substance is the same. The H2O is still the H2O. The substance is the same. But the size, because of the container, it gives you a smaller projection, but a wholesome projection of that sun. So again, we see that though the water substance is the same, the container size gives you the size of the sun, but nevertheless, a wholesome projection of the sun. Right? Very interesting, so different people with different circumstances, with different mindset, will see the sun in a different way. Right? So again, similarly with divinity, the state of the, our subtle body and our mind and our gross body and our subtle body gives us a projection. Although, it's wholesome, the size is very different. Now I'm going to push further the analysis. So suppose we say the sun, right? You have two containers, which is, still with water, you get the projection, but one of the container, it's broken, right? It's broken. and the water leaks out. What happens there? We see that there is no reflection in the water, in the container without the water. So what it says is that without the subtle body, the gross body cannot project anything. So when the container is broken, in the case of our body, when our body is diseased or aged, sometimes we don't get the full reflection. Or when that subtle body is drawn out from that body, the gross body, this is in the state of death or corpse, you see that the corpse is unable to project that sun. But what is really fascinating is to think deeply is that if now I collect that water and transfer the water into a smaller container or a container, the container that the water is not there would not be able to project. So that means that what we call life, the beauty of life would not be able to be experienced or projected without that subtle body, without the subtle body, right? The gross body would not be able to do it. But if we collect that water and we put it in another container, right? You see that what would happen? What do we get? The broken container would not have any reflection, but, the state of the bucket or the container, reflection is based on the state of the bucket or the container and the state of the water, right? So we see that, the broken body or the diseased body or the corpse would not be able to project, but the same water you collect and you put it in another container, it projects. So what we see here is that the projection of our life is because of our subtle body that is within us. That's why they say that life is about having both the Shava and the Shiva, right? So the Shava, the body, would not be able to project or experience life without the Shiva, right? So why all this is really important is that, what is reincarnation here means then, right? So when people say reincarnation means we are reborn again, experiencing the same thing, right? Having a memory of that experience. So let's go a little bit more deeper in terms of, through this analogy, what is reincarnation? Some people say, well, Atma travels from one body to another body, right? So is this true, right? Is there a transmigration that takes place? The answer is no. Actually, if you see very carefully, the Atma does not move in the sense that what we know. But what we see here is that the subtle body when the subtle body occupies another body, right? May not be the same body, may occupy another body, the projections commence, right? So the projections commence based on the body it takes on. If the body is very different, if the bodies, have different characteristics, the projections will be very different. The probability of the gross body 3, which is the container is empty, the probability of that gross body and the new gross body to be the same probability is pretty close to 0, right? So what we see here is that when the gross body dies, creatures and all eat it and it forms another body. The projections of that may be very different from this gross body 3. So what we see here is that the Shushma, actually the Sukma body or the subtle body occupies, powers another body in the projections commence, right? Is that what we mean by reincarnation, right? And this is the part that is very, complex and subtle that we want to push a little bit more analysis, right? So what is the probability of the water having full memory of that previous gross body and everything of the gross body? So some element, if that water has, memory, then it'll know, hey, I was on that body and I got leaked and I'm in this new body. right? So, and this is what sometimes people say, well, the DNA or the cosmic intelligence embeds this full knowledge. But the challenge we have here is that the water is neither born nor dies, but it occupies or takes on the form, right? So the question then is that what is the relationship between the water and the body? And this is the part that is really important, right? This Shukma body is what is omnipresent. It is everywhere. There's no time. But for our four-dimensional material world, for anything to exist, it has to have the gross body and it has to have that subtle body. So the subtle body can be everywhere, including occupying any particle, anything, including any bodies. So though it itself, does not need a body to exist, but the body needs it to exist and be conscious, right? So nature has embedded two things. One is the gross body and also a Shukma body, which is the software. Some say, well, the software is got consciousness, so it remembers, it's got a memory of all that has taken place. Possible, and we'll see in later models, is that true, right? But what we see here is that, this software, which we call consciousness, that is infinite, but when it comes into the body, it takes the form of the body. Similarly, like water, it takes on the characteristics of the body. And it is that, it's still, we can't touch the consciousness. It is, we not like the body, we can feel the body, but that which is aware is, there is no, you can't hold on to it, but we know the awareness is there. This is the part of the subtle body. You see? It's there, but you don't see it, but you're aware of it. So nature in the four-dimensional universe, we have a gross part, and it's also built that software. You've got the hardware and the software. And the software is what powers the material body. Right? So what is the DNA of the Shukma body or the subtle body? We know what that DNA is. That DNA is the same as that ocean that we had started with an expansive, transcendental nature of it. So now we come back to this whole idea that, this water in the container, the gross body, is part of this material universe. And that material universe also is embedded into that, subtle body. Same like the ocean, right? So we know what the characteristics in the DNA of that ocean. It's expansive, it's transcendental, and so on. Here then, that our body here, we have a gross nature, which is finite, but within that finiteness, we have something which is infinite. And this is how, in a very systematic way, the great saints and sages go through the analysis. So they see that, yes, the software is very important, but the software itself, you can't touch it. Like in your computer, you have the hardware. You can see it, you can touch it. But can you tell me what the software is? You can't see the software, right? It's an intangible component, but yet very important. It's a subtle component. But what you see is that software is a set of rules that has been put in place to run a sequence of logical steps or functions. So what we see here is that the software is actually knowledge that is coded. In that same way, the Shukma body is that knowledge or that consciousness that is critical to run this gross body. So what we see here is that, so what is reincarnation then? Well, we know what now reincarnation is. Well, we know that, that subtle body or the water that is within is what takes the shape in our body. But that in itself is infinite and expansive, you know. But we also know that our gross body has this form is changing, but we see that, the basic building blocks remains the same. So body itself, are we then talking about the form changes as reincarnation? Well, if that's the case, then, the form takes on now in this way, and before it takes form, it is in one state, then it takes on form, and then it dissolves. So if we see changes, it's still at the very surface level that we're seeing. So reincarnation is seen as one body to the other. It's still at the surface level. If you go deeper, even the body, the reincarnation is actually about the transformation from one state to the other state. Coming back to the consciousness itself is infinite. So it's neither birth nor it's expansive. So what do we mean by, the mere fact that it is, transcendental means there's no birth and death. So the only thing that we can then talk about reincarnation is actually about transformation or the changes in the form of the body, but the substance remains the same. So the question then is that, does the consciousness, which is, changeless, dimensionless, have a memory of, being in a container? Today in this container, tomorrow in another container, and another time in another container in this material world. Question then is that, in being in different containers, does that mean that I am re-emerging indifferently? And this is the kind of subtle arguments and discussions that takes place in this. Mahan says that, this, we are transcendental. If you go to the core of it, there is no birth and death, right? Others say even in the substance body, the building blocks, it's just the changes, right? If change is what you call reincarnation, then there is reincarnation. But if you go beneath that change, you see that, even the gross body, the building blocks are the same. So here you see that the discussion is not about yes or no, but there is some underlying important concepts. And so how is this relevant to us? So what does reincarnation means? Does it mean my past things that I do, I have to pay today? Then how many past did I have? Because if I'm infinite, then there must be infinite past, right? That have, existed in many, many things. Some may be good, some may be not so good. So what do I experience today? Is it a cumulative experience of all of that gives me what today is? If I did the cumulative, then if I was infinite, then there must be equal of what good and negative things cumulatively, today, then my life today should be defining what the circumstances is. So when you take that continuum, you see that the whole discussion of the past life and the previous, all those things slowly, has very weak foundations, right? Why should I pay for today's life, based on past? How far do I go back, right? So again, the questions that great saints ask is that, why should I pay for something that, happened in the previous life? The body is different. The consciousness is neither is born nor dies. So why should I pay for this? Now, to answer this question, why are lives very different? Well, it's based on the containers that we have, right? As I said earlier, if we take a particular shape, if our body is made out of particular, DNA, if our parents have certain genetic diseases that are passed on, our experiences may incorporate those diseases, certain characteristics, certain traits. But having said that, if we, so those are things that we cannot change. And, there are things that we can change, there are things that we cannot change. But we see that, when we become aware of it, we can take steps. We may not be able to change the traits or certain characteristics in us because of the genetic code, but we can change our circumstances through the change of our mind to understand that while the body is limited and nature's embedded all these good things and challenging things in our body, diseases, genetic disorder, and so on, the mind is infinite. It's not touched by this material world of, uh, blemishes and, and diseases and so on. So the mind remains pristine. And this is where we see that, that whatever limitations of the body, the mind can stand up in an expansive, majestic way and transcend the bodily limitations. So this is where, this whole idea of you pay for past and you get rewarded all disappear, because if you are that infinite, what does it really matter what happens in your past life? And you're charting every day a new frontier, and you can power that infiniteness in everything you do, even during the most challenging moments. And this is how great saints and sages, you know, harness, the limited mind to become really powerful. And that's why you see that people like great saints and sages have great names that when they attain this realization, they call themselves at Yoga Ananda, Yogananda. Yogananda means the union that gives you that bliss. Paramananda, attainment of the Paramatma that gives you that Anandam, that blissful. Uh, the same thing, Mahan means that Mahatananala, that means that universal personality that is transcendental to everything, the greatest. So you see that though many of them have that body, you see that the names evolve to depict that expansive ocean that is transcendental to birth, death, and reincarnation. It's an evolution of the human mind. So understanding that gross body and all its limitations and good things, but know that the gross body itself in its fundamental state is, remains the same. Only the form changes, and what changes is what we call illusion. What is truth means that which is changeless. So when you come to that state, actually you don't ask questions of what my past life is or what my future life is. It's the present that really matters. The present of being aware of the big I or the Paramatma, the ocean-like mindset that is transcendental to birth and death. Next class, we will do more examples of that infinite model. So here I wanted to show you that, how the kind of differences between the gross body, the subtle body, and the interrelationship between the gross and the subtle body. Sandosham.